Airing on Asheville FM 103.3 LPFM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcasts and podcast emanating out of occupied Chalagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world, and you can find our archives, transcripts, ways to follow us and support us at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. This week we're sharing an interview with Elia Ayoub, an anti-authoritarian historian and essayist originally from Lebanon, co-founder of From The Periphery, media collective, co-host of the Fire These Times podcast, and many more things. We spoke about the U.S. and Israeli war on Iran, its escalations into the wider region of West Asia, the axis of resistance, nuclear weapons, Hezbollah, motivations of the various actors, and thoughts on where that leaves anti-authoritarians in the imperial core countries like the U.S. Check out the show notes for copious links. So we're joined by Elia Ayoub. Thank you so much for being here, Elia.
Of course, thank you for having me.
This conversation is happening in the shadow of a huge escalation of violence by the Trump and Netanyahu regimes in West Asia, and as the Iranian regime lashes out across the region. For listeners who aren't familiar with your background and your work, could you say some things about yourself and the work that you concern yourself with?
Sure. So I'm originally from Lebanon, and sort of my background is in both history and journalism. I've done kind of dipped my toes in both academia and in journalism, and I also write pretty regularly, whether on my own newsletter, ontologies, or in various outlets. As we're discussing now, my latest essay on 972 Mag will probably be published in today or tomorrow, and I tend to focus on topics related to authoritarianism, internationalism. Obviously, the region I come from tends to be what I focus on the most, but I also live in the UK, so I write quite a bit about UK politics and US politics and so on. And in general, I tend to focus myself on, or rather, I tend to frame things as best I can through this anti-authoritarian lens.
And I really appreciate the insights that you give and the studiousness that you give to politics and ideas and movements from within like West Asia and Swana and like the Middle East and Lebanon in particular and Palestine as well. I think it's really useful for those of us who don't have as much experience to be able to pick up on the cues. So thank you for being here to discuss what's going on.
Yeah, thanks.
Roughly 2 weeks prior to the time that this interview will air, which will be on Sunday, on February 28th of this year, the U.S. and Israel launched attacks on Iran. These and subsequent attacks and counterattacks have hit schools, hospitals, desalination plants, apartments, power facilities, and other sites, as well as cascading out into widening attacks across the region. And obviously, it's also included attacks on political officials, military facilities and soldiers and such. I'm hoping that Elia can help enlighten us with some more information on the causes, the casualties and motivations in this conversation, as well as share his views on effective responses from anti-authoritarians living in the heart of empire. First up, can you kind of contextualize the timing of these attacks and sort of the relations between these different actors involved, like the dialogues around nuclear proliferation and sort of some of that?
Right. Well, this comes in the context of the Americans and Iranians were negotiating. They started those nuclear talks that were supposed to have been sort of completed under the Obama years, but when Trump took power, and I think this was the first time around, he decided that he didn't like that, so he just canceled it all. They were having these negotiations in Switzerland, and Oman was a negotiating party in between those two actors. In fact, the day before the bombardments of Iran started, Oman put out a sort of what you might call like a press blitzkrieg, in the sense that they put out all of these statements saying that things are progressing, we don't need that much, we're very close to finding an agreement and so on. And it seems in retrospect that they were aware that the Americans, or the Israelis at first, were planning to do something, and they wanted to try maybe desperately to stop it. And as we know, just the day after, quite actually hours later, the Israelis started bombing Iran. We found out, of course, not too long after that they managed to kill the leader of Iran, the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, who is now being succeeded by his son. And we also found out, I believe, a couple of days later, that the Americans did not actually initiate this, that this was initiated by the Israelis. It's just that the Americans decided to join. This was confirmed by Marco Rubio, as well as various like intelligence people and whatnot that were in the room when these things were decided. So that's sort of how it started. In many ways, the Israelis we know have been wanting to do this for quite some time. They've been talking about this for years now. This is not their first time bombing Iran. It's not their first time killing Iranian officials and so on. But obviously this is of a different scale than anything we've ever seen. The Iranians on their side have responded by also ignoring rules of war and international law. It's one thing to retaliate against US bases and against Israeli military headquarters and so on. But it's quite another, of course, to target a desalination plants, which they did in Bahrain, I believe, after the Americans bombed the one in Iran. And they also targeted, of course, airports and stuff like that, which is against international law. There's no nuance there. It's pretty black and white. The Americans since have, which I should maybe remind listeners that they don't know, have nicknamed this war Operation Epic Fury. And the Israelis on their side have nicknamed it Roaring Lion, just to speak of the sort of the level of hubris involved in all of this. And the death toll is, I don't have it in front of me, it's in the lower thousands as of time of recording. Among the very first attacks that we know of now has been definitively confirmed to have been an American attack is the one that killed some 160 people at a school, most of whom were schoolgirls, because it was a girls' school in Iran. And we're recording this on the 10th of March, and we're still very much living in the aftermath of all of this. Obviously, mostly affecting Iran and the wider region. And in my case, I can speak to how it's been affecting Lebanon as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. I don't know if it's helpful to say also that if we sort of like step back a little bit in the time scale, we see that this comes within a very short period, within a couple of months of the decapitation of the regime in Venezuela, or the removal of the president and his wife, plus the bombing of a few cities and facilities and the capture of a bunch of oil tankers. Mm-hmm. It also comes within, what was it, a year ago? Is that when the so-called 12-day war occurred, or a year and a half mm-hmm. ago, where similar playbook, the U.S. and Israel were having negotiations ostensibly around Iran's nuclear program, and then decided to launch attacks almost in a repeat, but like at a lower scale than what's happened already. And this after like Israel supposedly put a stop to or halt on the major military operations around Gaza. Yeah, I wonder if you could say a little bit about I do want to hear about the situation, the experience of people in Lebanon, and also your insights into the motivations of Hezbollah and its actions in this. But I wonder if you have ideas about the motivations of the different actors that you want to address. And not to forget, obviously, the massacres of civilians, the tens of thousands of civilians massacred by the Iranian regime from, within January, this just having reached the 40-day mourning period that our guest who spoke after those attacks, after those massacres, said that the population was going to be going through a 40-day mourning period before continuing to do protests against the regime. And this kind of matches up with the end of that 40-day period. But yeah, I don't know if you have anything you want to throw, or I just threw so much stuff at you that it might be kind of hard to pull together a response.
No, it's okay. I think so the first thing I think is very important that I always try and emphasize is that American and Israeli motivations are not usually the same. They tend to coalesce, and they, for the most part, don't contradict one another, and they find a way to just make it work, but they don't have the same motivation. So, for example, I think it's very reasonable, you mentioned Venezuela, it's very reasonable that Trump would have been pretty fine with a similar playbook happening in Iran, especially as the Iranian oil is of a much, it's not my expertise, my understanding is that it's much easier to extract than Venezuelan oil. So this would have been something that in his worldview would have been an easy victory if they kill the leader and they just get someone, or they approve of whoever follows and they work along those lines. That's precisely what they did, obviously, in Venezuela with Rodriguez, Maduro's vice president. But again, this is in many ways, this is quintessential imperialist hubris. They did not look at the differences between Venezuela and Iran. They didn't really do their homework. It's pretty clear that this is on the American side. I mean, motivated by sort of like imperialist hubris, a we can do whatever we want kind of thing. He is, the Ayatollah especially, is a pretty easy bad guy, especially in the MAGA world. Not that he wasn't one, we can talk about that in a sec, of course. But like in the sense that this is how it's been portrayed anyway in that world. And it's mixed in pretty well with the sort of like Christian Zionist and Christian nationalist variety that we see in the form of a Pete Hegseth. Christian Zionism and Christian nationalism are not necessarily the same thing, but they often, or they sometimes at the very least, certainly in his case, work together. On the Israeli side, it's more straightforward. They just don't want an Iran, period. They're not interested in a post-Ayatollah Iran. Sure, if there was a way for the Shah to come back, since the Shah was very pro-Israel the first time around, maybe they would have been fine with that. But given that this is not a realistic scenario, because the Shah has very little of, a base in Iran proper, given that the son of the Shah, for one, not even the Shah himself, but like the supposed new Shah that would come in power, should that ever happen, hasn't been in Iran since 1979. So they have been applying what has now become a pretty familiar rulebook, which is to destroy as much as they can as an end in itself. There's been some reports earlier today that there seems to be indications that maybe a limit is coming, in the sense that the Iranian response has already caused such a impact on the global economy with the shutting of the strait, that I think all of the G7 countries are now using their oil reserves and stuff like that. The Americans, I forgot the specifics, but they are considering, or maybe they've already done it by the time this comes out, to take out some important weapon from South Korea in order to put it elsewhere. So South Korea is freaking out. There's been so many different consequences to America and Israel bombing Iran and to Iran responding. Not to mention maybe the biggest one, which is how the Gulf has been reacting. Because with the exception of, I believe, Oman, they've all been targeted by Iran. By the time this comes out, this probably would have happened even more. And it sort of shattered the illusion of the Gulf, of this place where, you kind of go there, you sell your soul in a sense, and a return you have a pretty okay life, unless you are the majority of migrant workers living there, and a secure life and whatnot, the place where all of the influencers go and whatnot. So this is where we're at right now. Iran is the Iranian regime, by which I mean, is more resilient than what the Americans thought it would be. And as you said, maybe we can get into that briefly at least, and maybe we can get into it a bit more, although I'm sure your guests from Iran would have already explained most of what's important. But this comes just weeks after the Iranian regime itself massacred, at the very least, thousands, if not tens of thousands of people. Of course, we don't have an accurate number because they won't allow any independent reporters or researchers and whatnot in the country. Very reasonably, I mean, you can conclude that the Israelis saw an opportunity there while the regime in Iran was at its maybe weakest, or maybe they've assessed as like the most unpopular. Or it could have been simply, again, to go back to the hubris, they just concluded that now they can kill Khamenei, and this is something that they succeeded in doing obviously in the end, and they just took their chances. That's how they've been doing things as a general rule, and this makes sense from their perspective, the Israelis, I mean, because they have gotten away with a genocide that's been live streamed virtually 24/7 for over 2 years now. So from that perspective, from the perspective of Netanyahu, from the perspective even of like this so-called opposition in Israel that is virtually on board with everything that Netanyahu has done so far. Just 2 weeks ago, at the time of recording, Naftali Bennett, who was Prime Minister of Israel and reportedly wants to stand in the elections as well, which are in the near future, I don't have the date in front of me, has said that Turkey is the next Iran. And this, note that this was even before the Israelis bombed Iran, in this latest round of escalation. And it's led many people, I mean, myself, I've said this for a long time, I saw some even Turkish commentators say the same, to conclude that like Israel is, as a society, as a political culture, cannot really sustain itself without a never-ending enemy, without constantly going to war and expanding and having this boogeyman, whoever it might be, that they are fighting against. Because they have too many contradictions within Israeli society that very reasonably they would collapse were it not for this external enemy. And this is where we're at now. Just before we started recording, it's roughly 2:30 p.m. UK time on the 10th of March right now. I was looking at the Al Jazeera live feed, which has been on in my household for like many hours a day. And there was Pete Hegseth's speech And remember, I mean, I'm sure everyone knows by now, but he is the one who decided to change from Secretary of Defense to Secretary of War. And he said his usual stuff. Every other day, there's a different reasoning to what's happening. Trump just yesterday said that the war is almost over. And then just this morning, basically threatened to destroy the very nation of Iran, which has some 92, 93 million people living there, if they don't open the strait. The French have said that, like, I can go on and on. This has become from the looks of it, like virtually every country that is allied with the US is trying to find some path forward without stating almost the obvious, which is that this is the fault of America and the fault of Israel in the first place.
Wow, thank you. So with the genocide in Gaza over the course of over 2 years, right, it seemed like a lot of states were being forced to take positions that were at least critical of the genocide ongoing. And this includes a lot of the nations around the Gulf and around West Asia. And Iran throughout this, because of the proliferation of US bases, but even up into like Azerbaijan, Iran has sort of like lashed out in these last couple of weeks, destroying bases, but also attacking other sites they did attack. Like they've sent drones over into Turkey, and some munitions have landed there, which has threatened the possibility of NATO being brought into this. I wonder if you could talk about like the relationship between Iran and some of these other Gulf countries and a sort of defensiveness around Palestine, whether that's posturing, whether there's actually people putting themselves on the line or making positions throughout and following the immediate Gaza genocide, and how that sort of plays into the regional politics of this.
Yeah, I mean, they haven't had the best between Iran and the Gulf, monarchies, the petro-dictatorships. They haven't had the best of relationships always, but that's usually been resolved to, quote unquote, through proxy wars or through, for example, if you think of Syria in the early days of the civil war that followed the initial start of the revolution in 2011, the Saudis were funding some of the rebels that were against Bashar al-Assad, and obviously Iran sent its own men, funded Hezbollah, and was backing Bashar al-Assad. And that's sort of how they've been doing things. It's been this whole, Sunni on the one side and Shia on the other. It's more complicated than that. So, for example, Hamas is a Sunni party, but, in the sense of Sunni majority, and they've been backed by Iran on and off, with a notable exception of not up until, I think it was a few months before October 7th in 2023. Hamas and Iran were actually not on very good terms, partly owing to Syria because Hamas opposed the Assad regime. So like a bunch of these things happened, but in terms of the wider geopolitics of it all, there were signs that the Iranians and the Gulf were having some kind of rapprochement. Not so much in recent months, but there's been something that's been on and off. And it's sort of like, I'm not entirely sure of the details because at some point I don't follow the Gulf as much, or at the very least not as much, not in terms of their relationship with Iran specifically. But my understanding, based on, reading those who do follow these things a bit closer than I do, is that there wasn't necessarily an appetite, with the exception of potentially the Saudis, although this has not been confirmed as far as I know, at least at the time of recording. There hasn't really been an appetite to treat Iran as though it can be like decapitated entirely in terms of like regime change or anything like that. More that they just wanted some kind of compromise that benefited them as well, because the Gulf is extremely vulnerable, as we've been seeing now. The threats on the desalination plants, if should anything happen more than what has already happened in the case of Bahrain, we're talking about a catastrophe that I don't think anyone has really a plan of what to do in that case. That's why they've been really freaking out on that, because virtually the entire region, including Israel, by the way, depends on desalination plants. So yeah, sort of where we're at now, but this was set aflame by the Israelis and Americans. And very realistically, I mean, we can talk about this a bit if you want, but one of the many things that probably is going to come out from all of this is that I don't think the current alignment, or like the current pre-war alignment of the Gulf vis-a-vis America is going to remain the way it's been for very long. I think we're going to see a realignment of a pretty significant degree towards China, which, as far as the Gulf is concerned, is basically like the most stable bloc rather than America, which is always unpredictable.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, if you want to say more about that, I mean, even if internally stable, which obviously like China has been. It's also not actively on the same scale destabilizing its so-called allies and neighbors and such, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And obviously from the perspective of, your MBS and MBZ and the various monarchies and whatnot, they don't care about human rights abuses or anything like that. What they care about is would they get access to the resources of that state? And will that state do anything to stop us in any way, shape or form, or to interfere in our affairs? And China usually doesn't do that, at least when it comes to the Gulf Arabs. It's a different story, obviously, if you're, parts of the African continent that is depending on China for various things. There's an entire different dynamic happening over there that I'm not as familiar with, at least not yet. It's definitely an interest of mine to be better informed on that. And obviously, if you're China's neighbors, if you're Taiwan, if you're even like Japan or South Korea, you will have a very different view of China. But as far as the GCC, the Gulf states are concerned, China is just the stable bloc that's already going to overtake America. As of 2024, I believe the Saudi schools include Chinese in the curriculum. Stuff like that. Like it's pretty clear where the wind is blowing. And I think it's been frankly extraordinary to see how this American empire that we've known for, my entire life and, life of our parents and grandparents and so on is collapsing pretty rapidly. And what can come after that, obviously, you can have educated guesses, but we don't know.
I guess just to go back momentarily to the reason that Israel and the U.S. and Iran were at the table around nuclear weapons and Iran's nuclear program. I don't know if you could say a few words about like the history of the Iranian nuclear program. I know it's been a target of Israeli attacks, cyber attacks, and also espionage in the past. Mm-hmm. But also there's the issue of Israel holding nuclear weapons. Yeah. And refusing to state as much in a way that they can't, there's no possibility of accountability from the international community around that, and the U.S. shielding that. And I know that, I'd love to hear also about the idea of accountability on a larger scale from international institutions as much as you could, talk about them really existing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. So two things. One, I talk about the nukes, and two, I would argue, and we'll get into it maybe in a sec, that there's a very notion of accountability that Israel has sort of declared war on quite some time ago. This isn't new for them. In terms of the nukes, yes, the Israelis are one of the only two, there's two other states, I believe, maybe India and Pakistan, if I'm not mistaken, they have undeclared nukes. They are not part of the non-proliferation treaty. They haven't allowed any external auditors or anything like that. So it's kind of the irony of the situation, and something that we barely see ever reported, certainly in the West, that the two countries that are bombing Iran supposedly over Iran's potential nuclear weapons that Iran was supposedly thinking of doing, even though they were supposedly, again, in terms of the Americans, negotiating so that doesn't happen. Those two countries bombing Iran, one of them is the only country to have ever dropped a nuclear bomb on civilians twice, obviously with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And Israel is one of the few nation states to have nuclear weapons without even declaring that they do. So there's sort of this kind of irony of it all. But again, to go back to imperialist hubris, this isn't necessarily a surprise. But it's just something to note because it is generally very rarely. I tend to be obsessed. I did media studies in my background. I tend to be obsessed in looking at the coverage. And it is virtually never, ever mentioned, whether in written, whether on these interviews, or whether in the UK where I live or in the US and so on. It's virtually never, ever mentioned. So that's one thing. Iran's nuclear weapon, I'm not an expert on it, but my understanding is that they have concluded a while ago that this is what they need in order not to face the sort of threats that they are now facing. And of course, I'm talking about the Ayatollah's regime. And I think it's fair to say that on that front, they have basically been proven right, in the sense that the Americans are not planning an invasion of Russia, they're not planning an invasion of North Korea, and et cetera, and obviously China and so on, although it would have benefited them to do so, but because those places have nuclear weapons, they can't be touched. And the fear obviously now is that with the weakening of this international system, which has never been perfect, of course, we're going to see a race to get more nuclear weapons. Who knows? Hopefully not, but this is definitely the fear, because obviously if you are Iran's new Ayatollah, who is reportedly even more of a hardliner than his father was and 30 years younger, the conclusion that you would reach from this is that had you developed nuclear weapons, had you ignored the international system in the same way that the Israelis did. And I should note very quickly that part of how the Israelis got their nukes was that they were negotiating with South Africa at the time, apartheid South Africa, and I believe this was in the 70s and 80s. So a lot of, like, if you are the Ayatollah, the new Ayatollah's regime, and you're going to think about your long-term survivability, you will think of your internal threats, as the previous regimes have already done. So identifying all of the ethnic minorities, the women's rights movement, environmentalists, leftists, and so on, as threats to eradicate. And you're going to start thinking about how can you develop the bomb as soon as possible. So this is sort of how the world has gotten more dangerous as a result. In terms of accountability, I mean, one notable thing that has happened, and I think this has been missed often, as far as I could tell anyway, and I can give a bit of context to what I mean by what I'm going to argue here, is that the Israelis have declared war a while ago against the very notion of accountability. Anything related to international norms, international law, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, these are all enemy institutions. They're not just institutions that treat us unfairly or whatever. As Israelis, obviously I'm not Israeli, I'm speaking as if I was them, but they have to be destroyed. We have to create a world where they don't exist. So when Trump announced his so-called Board of Peace, asked nations to donate $1 billion in order to gain access as an alternative to the United Nations, this was like music to the ears of the Israelis. The Israelis have a long history of killing the possibility of alternatives that would have been actually better than the dominant regime. So I can give a few examples. Maybe starting with the most recent obvious one, which is Iran. The Iranian people, including, of course, Kurds and others, have been protesting and doing uprisings against the Ayatollah's regime for years and years now. And these protests have become bolder, more organized, and, subsequently the regime has responded even more and more violent. Obviously, as you said earlier, in the death toll in the most recent one is easily in the thousands, if not lower, tens of thousands. There could have very easily been, or very realistically, let's say, been a scenario where this regime that was led by an 86-year-old who had cancer and was very weak could have been overthrown in one way or another, or at the very least something to change, some kind of reform, something could have happened. It's not like inconceivable that this would be possible. And now it is not possible anymore because the Israelis stopped it. The Israelis made sure that they are the ones who are going to overthrow the regime, or at the very least, this is their intention, obviously. And so they have taken away the agency of people actually living in Iran. This is very common in terms of Israeli foreign policy. The logic there is pretty straightforward. If, let's say, the Iranians and others, like in Iran, had managed to overthrow the Ayatollah, had managed to force some kind of reform, and you have like this new government or whatever it might be, this new entity that comes into being, there's no guarantee that new government is sympathetic with the Israelis. This wasn't like in the cards in terms of people protesting on the streets. They weren't doing so out of a love for Israel. So this was one thing, and the Israelis just made sure right now that this wouldn't be a possibility, because obviously the Ayatollah that takes over will also be anti-Israel. And as I said, reportedly, he's even more of a hardline. Hardline, I'm putting this in quotation. These are terms that are used in the West. But if you look at Syria, for me, Syria is the most blatant example of this Israeli playbook that, again, is very rarely talked about. Following the fall of the Assad regime at the end of 2024, quite literally moments later, so this was like a matter of hours, as people were taking to the streets when we found out that Bashar al-Assad had fled, people like in Syria were taking to the streets and celebrating and so on. The Israelis had already launched a campaign of mass bombardments against Syria. And they did so for the explicit purpose, and they said so, this was their stated intention, to make sure that post-Assad Syria wouldn't be a threat to Israel. So what they did is that they cancelled the agreement that the state of Israel had signed with Hafez al-Assad, the first dictator of Syria, in, I believe, the 70s. There's a word for it, a disarmament, whatever, disengagement or something like that created this border zone between the Syrian Golan Heights, which have been occupied by Israel since 1967 and de facto annexed since 1981. As a brief parenthesis, it's been de facto Israeli territory for so long that someone like Smotrich, one of the far-right leaders in Israel, was actually born on an illegal settlement in the Golan Heights. That's how long it's been under de facto Israeli control. And they destroyed much of the air force of Syria, which was obviously the one that Assad was using to bomb people, and that would have now been, well, if they hadn't bombed them, under the control of the new government. There was no indication that the new government at the time would be sympathetic with the Israelis. That 10-day campaign that led to the fall of Assad included, for example, when they captured the citadel of Aleppo from the Assad regime, and members of the Jolani, who ended up becoming Shara, his brigade or whatever, flew the Free Syria flag as well as the Palestine flag. So if you're looking at this from the Israeli point of view, this is a potential threat, because what Bashar al-Assad and Hafez al-Assad before him had given the Israelis was basically, we won't do anything about the Golan Heights. So once that became a possibility that maybe there would be a new entity, a new state or whatnot that's not pro-Israel, the Israelis immediately intervened to destroy it. And this is something that they've done time and time again. This is one of the reasons why we've had Hamas in the first place in Gaza, because the Israelis determined that Hamas was a better alternative than the PLO, because the PLO, for all of its faults, and there were many, and there are still many, had some kind, or at the very least had enough people within it that were talking in this sort of like universalist language of a maybe one-state solution, a secular state, and so on. Whereas Hamas was a bit of a more cartoonish, Islamist group that, and especially in its early manifesto, included like death to Israel and anti-Semitic comments and stuff like that. And this was a much more convenient enemy for the Israelis than someone like the PLO that, a group like the PLO that was willing to negotiate with them and accept the two-state solution and whatever. And the same happened in Lebanon. I'm not going to go through it all. I did a very long monologue on my own podcast, The Fire These Times, where I talk about this. But the very short story of this is that there was a civil war in Lebanon from 75 to 1990. And by 76, the left-wing nationalist coalition that was allied with the Palestinians was winning the war. And so what happened is that Hafez al-Assad at the time intervened to destroy them. And 6 years later, and here I'm just giving like a bit of the headlines, 6 years later, the Israelis decided to invade Lebanon to destroy what was left of that coalition, and of course besiege Beirut. The Sarwan Shatila massacre happened against Palestinian refugees, and they later exiled the PLO to Tunis, and then they would go to South Lebanon, where they would stay until the year 2000. So from 1982 to the year 2000, the Israelis were militarily occupying South Lebanon with their allies, this kind of Lebanese proxy called the South Lebanon Army. And it is kind of in those fires that a group like Hezbollah was forged. And so in the beginning, before the 80s, you had, as I said, the kind of communists, nationalists, leftists, these Lebanese and Pan-Arabists and whatever that were allied with the Palestinians, and that, with various different platforms that, weren't always progressive or whatnot, but had the kind of a broad anti-Zionist and, pro-secularism to some extent policy. And what happened is that once those were crushed, first by Hafez al-Assad and then by the Israelis in 76 and 1982 respectively, what we had is Hezbollah. And then Hezbollah in the 80s and then 90s became the hegemonic force. And up until the war in 2024 and the assassination of Nasrallah and the ongoing kind of weakening of Hezbollah's forces, although we can talk more about Hezbollah in a bit if you want, they were basically the de facto kingmaker in the country. And those were the preferred enemy of Israel. I've described them as Israel, that they are best enemies in that sense. They create the image of a very convenient boogeyman that cannot be negotiated with, that is like irrational actor, primordial, Islamists that hate Jews because they do, or whatever the discourse is. And that allows the Israelis to bypass politics, to not talk about concrete crimes that they are doing, the violations that they commit, and so on and so forth, and instead paint what they're doing in civilizational terms. So when Hamas does a massacre, this confirms that discourse. When Hezbollah throws rockets to join Hamas's war, or as they did about a week ago now to avenge Khamenei's murder, it confirms basically from the Israeli side and to Israel's audience in the West especially, that they are fighting this sort of like civilizational battle on behalf of the West. And this is something that Netanyahu himself and, his son, for example, who went to the far-right conference in Hungary about a year ago now, I believe, basically said the same thing, that Israel is the gate of the West, protecting the West against these hordes of Muslims and so on. So this is what Israel has always seen as its priority. It depends on America, and this is something we can also get into, that this might change as Israel is becoming less popular in the US. For the first time in history, there are more Americans, according to polls, sympathize with Palestinians than with Israelis, which is a problem for Israel in the short to long term. And it could be partly why they are deciding to go all in now. They know that maybe their time is limited. They won't be allowed for one reason or another, certainly because they've been destroying the world economy, to continue at this pace, especially because Iran has shown willing to just open fire and destroy the world economy as well, in the sense of like, if we have to go down, we'll take you down with us. And so maybe the Israelis have concluded that now's the time for them to destroy as much as possible, so that when there is a new stalemate of some kind, they emerge from it relatively stronger than they were before.
A pretty fair assumption in politics, at least in the US, that oftentimes there's a relationship between domestic instability and the decision of heads of state to go to war, because it can be, whether it be like the Falklands during the economic collapse of Britain at the beginning of the Thatcher regime, or any of the instances of the US deciding to like bring instability to other countries in order to insert themselves and take control of various resources, as well as to like maybe unify the country. I think that there's a chauvinistic banner of like triumphant warriorism or whatever. The Trump administration, between the economic blowouts from the tariffs or the violence that's been happening, in cities like Minneapolis, that's been resisted by the populace, the breaking up and kidnapping of families, and the extraction of those people into prison camps on the southern border, has definitely not been doing very good things for Trump's administration in terms of public polling. Netanyahu's regime has been, he has faced so many lawsuits for corruption domestically. There have been at various points like large demonstration movements throughout his like coming and going into power against him and his party. So I wonder, like, if you could speak to, at least particularly because most of our audience is based in the US, so they'd be familiar with the US context, but if you're aware of in the Israeli context, is there a bit of look over there going on with the expansion and also the ability for Netanyahu to bring the argument that, like, look, we're being attacked from outside. Look, we can like clear more area from the south of Lebanon and possibly expand our territory for more settlements. Like, is he feeding red meat to a certain part of his base and thus like stabilizing his position, or is that like too simplified of an understanding?
No, that's precisely, at the very least, that's a big part of it. There's lots of components of Netanyahu's alliances, from the perspective of Israelis, they would call this right-wing to far-right. From the perspective of most of the world, this is basically far-right and further to the right. They have, of course, Messianic Zionists that do want to colonize the land. They have others that are more like pragmatic, that don't care about the colonizing beyond historical Palestine in that sense, and are more on the side of what's called the Land for Peace framework, which is this UN resolution that came out of like 1967, the Arab-Israeli War at the time, where, think of Egypt, that, Israel used to occupy the Sinai, the Egyptian Sinai. They gave it back to Egypt in return for Egypt normalizing with Israel. This was supposed to have happened with Syria as well, with the Golan Heights, but the Israelis at the time decided that they wanted to keep the Golan Heights. My understanding is that there was kind of like a resource component there in terms of the Golan Heights having water and other resources along those lines. And right now, the Lebanese government is, we'll talk about this a bit more in a sec because I'll focus on Israel, but the Lebanese government is also approaching it along those lines. Just the Prime Minister said this just the other day, I'll expand on that in a sec, that they are hoping that there could be like a land for peace situation, i.e. Israel withdraws from Lebanon and maybe some kind of deal occurs between the two. But within like Israeli society itself, I mentioned the Turkish commentator repeating what I myself have said, and other folks honestly have said, because it's pretty straightforward, that they absolutely need, and Netanyahu himself needs, to expand always on a war. Like Gaza was never going to be enough. Lebanon would not be enough. Iran is the big one now. As I said, Naftali Bennett was pretty open in saying that Turkey would be next, which would be quite the nightmare for NATO. But this is where we're at. This is a hyper-militaristic culture, a political culture, one of the most militaristic cultures in the world. Conscription is obligatory for Jewish Israelis, and I believe Druze Israelis as well. And so virtually everyone in Israel, because Jews are the majority of Israeli citizens, have served in the IDF in one way or another. That's how they have so many reservists. And a lot of the state is basically modeled around that. They don't do much more than that in terms of their own economy. A lot of it is tech and weaponry. They test those weapons on us, i.e. the people of the Middle East, Bellingcat had an article just, 2-3 days ago that I saw, in which they showed that there was even a new bomb that wasn't previously used in battle that is now being used either by the Americans or the Israelis. And what usually happens is that the Israelis would do that, and then they would go to some kind of arms fair in, Paris or Abu Dhabi or whatever. And then, this weapon that wouldn't have been battle tested beforehand is now battle tested.
There's a book called The Palestine Laboratory that kind of goes through that status.
Yes,
of the
by Lowenstein. Yeah.
Book, yeah.
Yeah, and so this is something that they've done. I mean, Yuval Abraham for 972 Mag wrote about this in the early days of the Gaza genocide as well. I think it's called Project Lavender or something, the AI that they were using. There's a pretty decent chance that the Americans used a similar AI because, they use Claude. And it could be how that school was targeted. Because if you didn't know, that the school was next to a base that wasn't being used anymore, then the AI could have concluded that the school was not really a school or whatever it might be, or maybe this was worth the damage because it was next to a military base that the AI may have thought was still active. It's very possible that this is what happened. Of course, we don't know yet, and maybe we never know. I don't know. But this is sort of where we're at in the sense that this is Israeli economy. They don't produce much more than that. Their cultural output is very little, not to mention the most recent backlashes in the past couple of years in terms of BDS and whatnot, and how it's become pretty mainstream to not be pro-Israel, especially in the West, or certainly in the West. And besides that, they may import their hummus or whatever it might be, but that's not going to be enough to sustain an entire economy, so they need war. And that's putting aside the fact that their economy is essentially also on life support thanks to the Americans, which has been a bipartisan thing for the past decades now. Biden obviously was in power when the genocide started, and Trump took all of this and put it on steroids. Who knows what would happen in the future should a Democrat come again, given that how unpopular Israel is among the Democratic base. But, maybe I'm saying a bit too much at this stage, but this is sort of the situation as of now.
If you want to support The Final Straw Radio, you can subscribe to our podcast via various streaming platforms, follow, rate, and share our materials online, and learn more at tfsr.media. And if you'd like to fund our transcription work that allows for easier translation, more accessibility of content, and the zines that we produce for each interview, consider picking up some merch from us or making a one-time or recurring donation via PayPal, Stripe, Venmo, or LibrePay. Or joining our Patreon to access early release content and other goodies via the links that you can find at tfsr.media/support. Finally, if you'd like to hear us on your local radio station, visit tfsr.media/radio to find more info or reach out to us for some help. Thanks for listening. The Final Straw Radio is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
Hello, Inman here from Strangers in a Tangled Wilderness, an anarchist publishing collective that's been putting out work for over 20 years. We just put out a new book, and we think you're really going to like this one. Orso, Wartime Journals of an Anarchist, contains the first-person narrative of Lorenzo Orsetti, also known as Heval Tekosher Peling, now Shahid Tekosher, an internationalist soldier in Rojava. Orso's journals were originally published in their native Italian following his death, and we have the great honor of publishing the first English edition. It's through our devotion to each other that we, all of us, live forever. This memoir is a story of the everyday bravery that not only defeated the Islamic State, but proved that a better world is possible and within our grasp. That's what Margaret Killjoy had to say about the book. What will you say about it? If you want a sneak peek for free, you can read the essay Martyr Culture by Sarah Bloom, which accompanies and helps contextualize Orso's journals. You can also hear an audio feature of the essay, as well as my interview with Sarah about her essay on the Strangers in a Tangled Wilderness podcast, or Live Like the World is Dying. Find it all at tangledwilderness.org. And remember, every storm begins with a single raindrop. Try to be that raindrop. Or so.
Yeah, that puts a heavy weight on or a lot of work in the idea that the Democratic base defines what the Democratic Party does. But yeah, I mean, they can only go on for so long with that until they start taking the path that the Republicans have taken. I wonder if this is a good opportunity, I think. Sort of flipping from that last sentence, but moving over to what's been happening in Lebanon, and maybe I really appreciated that use of like best enemy as a term for Hezbollah or for Hamas. I'm not sure. I don't recall which one you.
Both.
But like, so I guess like, and taking the opportunity to talk about an axis of resistance or whatever, like there's Venezuela and Iran at various points have been declared, I think, during the G.W. Bush administration at the beginning of the global war on terror, defined this, like, whether it be some countries that were associated with like Venezuela, the pink wave that was happening in Latin America at the time, or other countries that were posing opposition to the U.S. and Israel's decisions of what was going to go on in the so-called Middle East at the time. Iran was one of these countries that came up as part of the axis of evil at the time. But this term, like axis of resistance, is something that anti-imperialists in the West have been parroting, and Iran has been viewed as a bastion of opposition within a multipolar vision of the world, where it's not just one unipolar monopoly of Western, NATO, US, Israel control, but also Russia, China, Iran, maybe other countries having a possibility of pulling their own opposition, having alternatives to imposed American and like Euro-American imperialism in the world. And Hezbollah has been one of these organizations that has been promoted by some of these multipolarists as a like some sort of like leftist resistance because it's opposing US and Israel. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the politics of that party, how it plays into the multi-faction way that Lebanon runs, and like what decisions they've been taking recently, and maybe the logic that you can see behind it.
Yeah, definitely. This is like a trigger point for me because I have been complaining about Hezbollah for a long time now. And it is a extraordinary disconnect really between what I know of the party as someone who grew up there in Lebanon as a left-wing person, and how this party is sort of portrayed in certain spaces, not just in the West, but, in parts of Latin America. I know this is also the case in parts of Africa and so on. It's quite extraordinary because Hezbollah has essentially followed the Iranian playbook as of the 80s, by which I mean in 1979 when the revolution happened, or arguably a revolution followed by a counter-revolution. Essentially, the Shah exits, the Ayatollah enters. The Ayatollah's men opened, or rather turned their guns after getting rid of the Shah, to the leftists, to the Iranian communists and so on. Hezbollah did very much the same thing when they got into power in Lebanon. They, as I said, were the rose in the sort of the fires of the civil war, and especially in the context of the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon, which had already started by then. Hezbollah was, like, there were different forms as of the early 80s, but it was kind of officially formed in 84, 85, I believe. And one of the first things that they did with besides going against the Israelis, was to try to get dominance first against I don't have the timeline in my head right now. I think first against the communists and then against Amal, which was at the time rival Shia party, which would then become sort of allies, but that's like a more complicated story, which we can get into because there's been developments on that too recently. So what Hezbollah did is that they also declared effectively war against Shia Marxists. Notably, they assassinated intellectuals like Mehdi Amel and Hassan Mrouer, who were both influential figures in southern Lebanon. Southern Lebanon, for those who don't know, was like historically not just Shia majority, but very, very much working class. This is where you had like a lot of union activities, this is where a lot of Lebanon's agriculture is, which is why like Israel destroying a lot of it is very concerning for Lebanon itself, beyond Hezbollah, beyond whatever Hezbollah's future is. But that's because the point of Hezbollah at the time wasn't to just like resist the Israelis, but was to also be the hegemon within the resistance. Resistance in Lebanon is an old thing. It's an old concept. It's linked also to the Palestinian resistance. And the term for resistance in Arabic, muqawamah, became just associated with Hezbollah exclusively and specifically. So if in Lebanon today you say al-muqawamah, the resistance, you're exclusively talking about Hezbollah. And so in many ways, even like, how do I say this? Even from like at a discursive level, they've co-opted the term resistance to mean just them. And so if you're against them, you are therefore against the resistance, which obviously makes you an agent of Israel or maybe a fool or what have you. That's certainly what I've been accused of multiple times by people who support Hezbollah in Lebanon, but honestly, mostly online. At the same time, the thing that's very difficult about Hezbollah right now is that they've basically been the only available option for a good chunk of southern Lebanon. Regardless of how you feel about Hezbollah, if you are in South Lebanon, you don't have that many options if the Israelis come knocking at the door, or in the more maybe Israeli format, come to bomb that door. There hasn't really been any effective fighting force that could rival the Israelis. Not that Hezbollah really rivals it, but in the sense of putting up a fight in one way or another. Like Nasrallah was killed, over a year ago now, and Hezbollah is still able to target the Israelis. The Israelis have failed twice now at the time of recording to have an incursion via helicopter in eastern Lebanon and the Bekaa Valley, because Hezbollah found them. And so Hezbollah still has that capacity, and they've been doing this, targeting the Israelis and fighting the Israelis for 4 decades now. And it's not going to be that easy, or even possible, maybe, we're not entirely sure, that some kind of alternative comes ever. Because what's happening now, and I'm skipping a bit, but I'll do that. I'll skip a bit and then I'll go back to a bit more contextualization. What's happening now is that southern Lebanon is effectively being told, and Lebanon as a whole is effectively being told, that the problem is not just Hezbollah. The problem is that anyone ever who thinks about resisting Israel is going to be dealt with as a terrorist group that ought to be destroyed. There is no compromise right now as far as the Israelis are concerned. There hasn't been arguably ever. The Lebanese state has, even as of yesterday, which is the first time in certainly a couple of generations, called for direct negotiations with the Israelis. And as of time of recording, the Israelis have already said no. So this is sort of where we're at now. If you are Hezbollah, you have concluded that it is a fight to the death and there's no way out because the Israelis don't respect any kind of ceasefires. And you would be right in your assessment, because when they signed the quote-unquote ceasefire at the end of 2024, I believe, and this is a figure from UNIFIL, which is the UN peacekeeping forces in Lebanon, who were themselves targeted, I should say, by the Israelis just 2 or 3 days ago. Ghanaians' forces were targeted and bombed by the Israelis and they were injured. They documented some 10,000 plus violations by the Israelis in that year plus year and a half or so period, I think 18 months or so, which is roughly, I did like a quick calculation, roughly 23 times a day, something like that. So that's what the Israelis think of when it comes to a ceasefire. Like the joke is that you cease and we fire, essentially. So if you're Hezbollah and, you've known this obviously for a while. I mean, I don't think they're naive when it comes to the Israelis. You know that the ceasefire was just an excuse for Israel to focus its ire elsewhere, and that they're going to be back soon. So what Hezbollah has been doing in the past 18 months reportedly was to also rearm, which isn't to say that they will be as strong as they were like 3-4 years ago, but I don't think they are like on their way out quite as easily as the Americans seems to believe is possible. Another dilemma with this entire thing is very much the elephant in the room, is that the force that is supposed, if you believe the Americans and if you believe the Israelis even, and even honestly most of the West at this point, to replace Hezbollah is the Lebanese army. The Lebanese army, which is itself funded and armed by the Americans. The same Americans that are funding and arming the Israelis at obviously a very disproportionate rate to whatever they give to the Lebanese army. The Lebanese army has no capacity whatsoever to defend Lebanon, for example, against most of Israel's weapons. They cannot fight back the tanks. Lebanon doesn't have that many of them, and so on and so forth. Whereas a guerrilla movement like Hezbollah is most suitable for this sort of terrain. And so Israel, in many ways, is once again making Hezbollah's argument on its behalf. Hence why I describe them as like each other's best enemy. And so where we're at now is that Hezbollah has, in its most recent action against Israel, 2 days after the killing of Khamenei in Iran, Hezbollah decided to launch rockets in Israel. This is highly, highly controversial in Lebanon. In fact, I would say the vast majority of the population, I think it's fair to say, was not happy about this and is not in favor of it, if only because Lebanon has also been in deep for a long time now, and this is obviously making it worse. At time of recording, some 10% of the population has already been displaced. The deaths is in the hundreds, injured in the thousands, and the number is certainly going to go up. So Hezbollah is at its all-time unpopular in many ways in Lebanon. Even its erstwhile ally Amal, as I mentioned earlier, which is the other Shia party in Lebanon, but that is not really aligned with Iran, voted in favor of the government declaring Hezbollah's military activities illegal a few days ago. So in many ways, Hezbollah has no political allies left in Lebanon. If the Israelis stop today, if the Israelis, and this is like my prediction, although I don't think that's what they're going to do, and just withdraw and go back to Israel and observe the ceasefire and respect international law and so on and so forth, I think Hezbollah would be in very deep trouble in Lebanon itself. If the Israelis do what Israelis usually do, which is to continue and continue and continue until they are just forced to stop for one reason or another with no kind of long-term plan as to whatever they do, Hezbollah is likely to actually benefit from it all. We don't know. It could be that the Israelis are basically calculating right now that they need to make sure Hezbollah has nothing left. It might be that that's what I know that that's what they're going for, but they may succeed in that. We don't actually know, because obviously Hezbollah's capacities are not like public record or anything. And even the Israelis don't exactly know. Or it could be that they are grossly miscalculating and underestimating what they're up against, because they've had so many successes from their perspective so far that they are incapable of planning for the eventuality that they may actually lose at some point in one way or another.
Could you talk a bit about what the Israelis are doing in southern Lebanon with that displacement related to the ecological impacts as well as the clearing of villages?
Yes. So in 2024, Israel started bombing large parts of Lebanon, with, as usual, focusing on South Lebanon. Lebanon and Israel obviously border one another, for those who don't know. And they've been doing this by creating what they call buffer zones, which is, as it sounds, maybe destroy as much as possible and make sure the land is uninhabitable, so that you have a certain corridor between Israel and, let's say, Hezbollah or whatever. The corridor notably would only be in Lebanon itself, not in Israel, obviously. I'm saying obviously, at the very least from their perspective, this is pretty obvious. And so they've been bombing the out of Lebanon in 2024. This was the worst kind of bombings at the time, only to be surpassed by what's happening now. This includes just literally dynamiting whole villages. They would force everyone out, line the houses, often traditional houses that are 100+ years old, older than the state of Israel, and just detonate them all. This is also accompanied by a campaign of ecocide, by which they not just set fire to agriculture, burning down olive trees, which is of course a tradition that they've picked up from doing the same in Palestine, but also spraying herbicides throughout parts of southern Lebanon. And at the time when they did so, a few weeks ago, where they also did that in Syria itself and on the Syrian-Lebanese border, I believe, in the south. And the goal of all of that is to just make sure that Lebanese farmers, those who harvest olive trees and other crops that are very common in Lebanon, especially in the south, are unable to do so. So it could be as simple as not destroying the olive trees, but preventing the farmers from going and harvesting them, or by bombing olive trees, which they've also done. About a week ago as well, shortly after Hezbollah joined the war after Israel killed Khamenei, Israel has put out these evacuation notices, as they call them, which are basically these maps that are now very familiar across the region. And Iran has also those same maps that were first used against Gaza, and that then used against Lebanon and also parts of Syria. And as I said, now Iran, where they basically take the map of, let's say, Lebanon or South Lebanon and whatnot, and they would have, for example, an arrow, and they tell people, everyone who is south of this line is in danger, you have to go north of this line. They did so about a week ago with the entirety of South Lebanon. They told all of South Lebanon to leave and to go north of the Litani River, which is the kind of one of the borders of South Lebanon. That's where the occupation of Israel ended in its border, between 1982 and the year 2000. And they are forcibly displacing, as I said, as of now, 10% of the Lebanese population, many of whom were already forcibly displaced the first time around, as in 2024. It's not even the first time around, but the first time around in a while. And they have those same maps for the entirety of Dahieh. Dahieh being the southern suburbs of Beirut. Dahieh just means suburb in Arabic. I say this because I've seen some coverage of people calling it Dahieh suburb, but that just means suburb of Beirut, as well as eastern Lebanon, the Bekaa Valley, the Be'ah, as you call it, where Hezbollah also has a base there. A base, about which a popular base, as in people support them there. And they've also, issued those maps for that part of Lebanon. As part of the propaganda that the Israelis are putting forward is that they're only focusing exclusively on Hezbollah fighters, but that is obviously not true. At least that's not true. I don't know how obvious it is to listeners. I think it is. Israel in 2006 developed what's called the Dahi Doctrine, named obviously after Dahi, in which it explicitly states, like that is in its own definition, that they're going to disproportionately target like civilian infrastructure, by which I mean like hospitals and buildings and schools and so on, to put pressure on a group like Hezbollah. That's how they view things. That's how they interpret things. And so we knew obviously this time around that they're going to do the same. That's precisely what they've been doing. They've been killing and destroying hospitals. They've bombed ambulances. I already mentioned about the fields and the agricultural fields and so on. Just yesterday, at time of recording, they even killed a priest who decided to stay in one of the villages that Israel ordered everyone there to leave. And there are lots of people in South Lebanon, for one reason or another, that are not leaving, either because they're not mobile, they might be too old or whatnot, or because they don't have any other place to go. Like Lebanon is extremely small and densely populated as it is. They may not be able to afford it. They cannot pay rent to go elsewhere, whatever it might be. Or in some cases, because they just don't want to, because they don't believe that anywhere would be safe, or because they want to, as a matter of principle, not leave their land just because a foreign occupation force is demanding that they do. So that's sort of the kind of the picture, in a sense, the broad picture. And I already mentioned about Hezbollah, but I don't know if you want to get more into it. Oh, I get actually, I didn't. I'll expand briefly if you want on the reputation that Hezbollah has outside of Lebanon and why that's always been a bit bizarre for me. It's one thing that if you're in southern Lebanon and you're forced to have to accept, for example, that there is such a thing as Hezbollah, and you don't have any other option, that's one thing. And I don't reserve my anger to someone like that. I'm not in that situation. I don't know what it's like, and I'm not here to judge, someone who is in that situation. But if you're abroad, and I don't think you have that excuse, and it's very bizarre for me to have people who call themselves left-wing and who think that Hezbollah was ever a left-wing party, because Hezbollah itself has never called itself a left-wing party. As I said, with the Iran thing, it is ideologically anti-Marxist, for example. It is ideologically anti-communist. It opposes the ideology of communism as a matter of principle, not just like whatever. It's
like secularism and materialism are right.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And this is has been from the beginning a far-right, ultra-religious organization that has a very strict patriarchal hierarchy with Nasrallah at the time, and of course now Naim Qasim at the head of it, and above them is the Ayatollah, because they follow also the Wilayat al-Faqih model, as in like the I think in English is like guardian of the jurisprudence, with the Ayatollah at the top. And so it's a very, very strict conservative movement that never pretended to be anything but that. It is true that, yes, at the same time, they've also resisted against the Israelis, and that in and of itself is a good thing. But that doesn't make you left-wing just because you did that. As we know from World War II, for example, you have far-right movements in various parts of Europe that were also anti-Nazi. This doesn't make them left-wing just because they were anti-Nazi. It's a very similar situation here in the sense that a lot of different actors are opposed to Israel and Lebanon and the region. Being anti-Zionist is almost apolitical in the sense that almost anyone can be that. It's not an explicitly left-wing thing to be. And you could be anti-Zionist for various reasons. You can be anti-Zionist because you're anti-Semitic. You can be anti-Zionist because you are a ultra-nationalist Lebanese. You could be anti-Zionist because you're a pan-Arabist or an Islamist, or for whatever reason. It doesn't mean that they're all the same just because they have that in common, essentially. But I think that's part of the mistake that's made when it comes to Hezbollah, historically anyway. And also the fact that they are the only Arab group, even if you include states here, that can say that they've had successes against the Israelis. The Egyptians cannot say that, the Syrians cannot say that, the Jordanians cannot say that. Obviously, the rest of the Gulf don't even want to say that in the first place. But none of the others, like this quintessential Arab cause, the Palestinian cause, no one else can really say that they have that. And this was very special at the time, especially in the year 2000 and then even in 2006, because Hezbollah could say that. And Hezbollah, unlike the majority of Arabs and the majority of Arab parties and Arab states, is a Shia movement. A minority of Arabs are Shias. And this was always significant because Hezbollah was able to gain a lot of credit for, being a Shia majority, a Shia party, but also having Christian allies, also being allied with the Sunni party, Hamas, and all of those things. And this is one of the many ways where Hezbollah was, or at least was able to be pragmatic when it needed to.
So I think if people, at this point, because we've been speaking for a while, if people want to dig more into some of this history, I don't know if you still have openings in the current class on Lebanese history that you were putting on, but I'm assuming that there will be more in the future if you want to talk about that. Because I want to round up maybe by directing towards anti-authoritarians in the Imperial Core, ideas about how they can put all of this information that we just got into use, or kind of like inspirations about how we can change these large things based on our proximity to where the bombs are manufactured, who's deploying the bombs, and that sort of thing. So would you mind saying a few things about the podcasts that you work on and produce, and also about those classes that you teach?
I'm also happy to send you links to like various, fundraisers, mutual aid efforts and whatnot that are happening in Lebanon for those that do have the means to do so. But yes, I do have a podcast called The Far East Times. It's not like a Lebanon, even Middle East focus podcast necessarily, but like this always something that I bring in whenever I want to and whenever I can in many ways, because it's always obviously in the back of my mind. But it's like an internationalist focused podcast that also does a lot of exploration of alternative futurities, and always from this perspective of framework of anti-authoritarianism. The most recent episode that I recorded, for example, which isn't out yet, I had to postpone it because of the situation, is on solarpunk, and on sort of like solarpunk for the year 2026 in a sense, with people that were previously on. And so it was, so in the sense that like, it's not only strictly about, for example, geopolitics or anything like that. It's a bit of both the political is personal, the person is political, but also storytelling is political, and we need to treat it as such. So the podcast, The Far East Times, is part of the From The Periphery media collective, which I co-founded less than a couple of years ago now. That includes other podcasts such as the Mutual Aid podcast, Syria, The Inconvenient Revolution, Hida, the Counter-Colonial Jewish Conversations, as well as Politically Depressed and other projects that we're working on. It's mostly audio, although, for example, in the case of Politically Depressed, Ayman Makarim also has a YouTube channel that people can check out. And we talk about some of the topics that, you and I talked about today, as well as beyond that. I am also giving a class, yes, on Lebanon. As I said, I'm a historian by trade. And the class is on, especially post-war, as in post-1990, and the post-war is in quotation. I explore why in the class itself. Lebanese history and politics. The first session of the next class, which will be the second class, will start the day before this episode is released. I believe if you're releasing it on Sunday, because I start on Saturdays. But if people are interested, they can already send me an email or message me on Signal to express interest in future classes, the next one will very likely be in May and June, And it will be very likely on Saturdays, couple of hours every Saturday for 5 weeks. And I'll be doing this for as long as I can, really. And there's always a component of what's happening currently in like the current events, so to speak. So obviously the war now is going to be the elephant in the room if I don't bring it up, so I will. But it's also like there is a structured syllabus in which I talk about various concepts that I took from my own PhD, because my PhD was on post-war Lebanese history, and specifically hauntings and the effects, kind of the long-lasting effects of that civil war, the 75 to 1991 that I mentioned. And it's a very informal class as well, I guess I should say. It's a bit like the podcast I usually do. It's very personal, it's very informal, and although there are like things I focus on, but it's very also participatory for those who like that sort of format. Yeah, happy to send you the link for that for those who are interested. If they don't manage this time around, there's always other times. And besides that, as I said, I'm also happy to send you the links to various like mutual aid initiatives in Lebanon. I'm sure there's a lot in Iran as well, but I'm obviously more plugged in to the Lebanese context for folks who have that sort of disposable income and want to support in those ways.
Thank you. Yeah. And like as someone who also lives in the West, I think that for a lot of us, when we learn about these very complicated situations, people's lives are taken, stolen, destroyed by the implications of all this military expansion. And after this conversation, it should be clear to a lot of people that there's not just simply like, well, I don't like what's going on, so I'm going to go out and like see what I can do to support Hezbollah or support the Iranian regime or the Iranian Revolutionary guard. So, like, I wonder if you have suggestions about, besides the mutual aid links that you were going to send, if there are helpful ways for people in the West to conceptualize their relationship to this and their relationship to power. Like, we had as a guest one of the participants in your podcast network, Leila Shami, speak about People's Want and this new model for internationalism, anti-authoritarian internationalism, that would be counter to some of the past failed ones. So I don't know if anything occurs to you in terms of like speaking to the audience in the US, for instance, about like ways of conceptualizing how they have agency when they clearly have a non-democratic government doing all this on their behalf.
Yeah. So, of course, this is going to be like an imperfect answer because it's going to be very much dependent on one's positionality and resources and where they live and what they can do and all of that stuff. But, you know, to focus on maybe Americans, and this is going to be like a general thing because, again, we can get bogged down in the specifics. But I'm a pragmatist at heart in many ways. And there are certain things that one can do in America to kind of drive the discourse in a certain way that doesn't necessarily have a concrete effect on the ground, at least not in the immediate future. But for example, I did mention that for the first time in history, Americans are more sympathetic to Palestinians than to Israelis. And while I am, to put it very mildly, not a fan of the Democratic Party, there could be some ways forward there because the Israelis are hyper dependent on the Americans. And to the extent that this is a tool that American citizens have, it's a good thing to let, you know, potential Democratic candidates or whatever, that being pro-Israel is a disaster for their electoral campaign or whatnot. And that's, to some extent, we're already seeing this. I just would be very happy if we see much more of this going forward, because the Israelis will actually be in trouble should they have a administration in America that, even though that administration obviously wouldn't give a shit personally about Palestinians or whatnot, but, you know, may want to not alienate their own base or whatever it might be, who knows. It's one of those things that it may or may not make a difference, and I leave it sort of like to individual listeners to decide whether this is a worthwhile thing to do in terms of their own energy and resources. I can't quite comment on it personally myself. In terms of sort of like even more broader than that, anyone who kind of spends time, I don't know, sending solidarity or whatever to the likes of Hezbollah or the Iranian regime or whatnot is not just like, I don't know, doing the wrong thing. They're also very much wasting their time. This isn't something that the Ayatollah gives a about. It's not something that they think about on a daily basis. Whatever money you can send to them, which obviously I'm not saying that the people do that, I know it's even illegal to do so in the US, is going to be peanuts compared to what they already have from the Iranian regime, for example. So there's nothing materially anyway that one can do if you're a tanky in that sense, other than make it much more difficult to even think of an alternative in the first place. And if you want to support southern Lebanon, for example, there's absolutely no reason why you can't do that. I mean, without thinking about Hezbollah at all. Lots of people live in South Lebanon. Lots of mutual aid initiatives exist to support people having to flee the bombs or whatnot, or people who choose to stay back home or whatever it might be. And you don't have to even think about Hezbollah whatsoever. It would be like a people-to-people thing. And that's in general what I prefer. What I think the path forward should be, and it's very unsatisfying. It's very like inconclusive. It feels like it doesn't produce results that we like to see in the immediacy. And I know that this can be very frustrating, to put it mildly, but the alternative is so much worse. To kind of skip all of this and to say that we live in this multipolar world now. And as a parenthesis, I'm hoping to start also giving one of those classes on opposing multipolar imperialism in the coming months. I'm still slowly working on it. And anyone who's interested in anything I talked about, they can just send me an email or Signal. They're all very easily available online. And I'm easily approachable, as long as they introduce themselves, because I don't answer anonymous emails and stuff. But yeah, so there's a lot we can do that is unsatisfying maybe for now and won't give results in the immediate future. But as an example, if we talk about Iran, there's very little I can do here. I'm talking before the war, like when the Ayatollah was massacring people. There's very little I can do here as someone in the UK, because the UK government is already not on the side of the Ayatollah. And there is, of course, the risk, as we're now seeing it play out, that contributing to public denunciations of the Ayatollah can just enable or embolden a pro-war faction here in the UK, for example, as we saw already in the US. So it's kind of a difficult situation to be in the UK or in the US, and when it's like the Ayatollah killing people in Iran, for example. But one thing that you can do is learn about Iran's history, stand in solidarity with people on the ground, send them messages when this is possible, saying we're thinking of you. You would be surprised by, maybe you don't, I don't know, but people underestimate the value of this. Like when you think of Palestine, there's very little that protests in the West or whatever has done to actually stop the Israelis. Gaza is much worse off today than it was 5 years ago, but many more people in the West support Gaza and Palestine in general than they did 5 years ago. So we haven't seen results on the ground, and it's very easy to conclude then that this was all for nothing and that there shouldn't have been any street protests or BDS actions or whatnot. But I don't think that's sort of the timeline we as individuals, because we don't have the resources that states do, I don't think this is sort of the timeline we are working at. I think it's a much slower and much long-term timeline, but it doesn't mean one that we abandon and most importantly kind of cede to the other side, whether it's the far right or, warmongers or whatnot. Even if the work or the job is very slow, it still needs to be done. And when it comes to Iran, I wrote this essay just like a month ago, and it's just an essay. It's just like a bunch of words written together and put in a newsletter. And then I did also like an Instagram version of it, saying like Iranian protesters do not owe us an explanation. And a lot of Iranians shared gratitude for me writing this, and people in Iran as well. One person in Tehran translated it into Farsi. And it's like, did that make any difference on a geopolitical level? No, it didn't change anything. It did not influence Netanyahu or Trump or obviously the Ayatollah or whatnot. But it told people, those who had access to it, who were already dealing with like an impossible situation, that they're not alone. And sometimes if there's nothing else you can do, that's still something to do. That's still something that should be done. And I think it's very wrong that I've had this feeling for a while now that this is something that a lot of people on the left see as like non-important because maybe it's not material and materialist or whatever in a way or another. Or at least that's one of the interpretations, I'm not sure. But it should still be done. So if people listening to this don't know what to do, it's understandable. I mean, I don't always know what to do. I live in a part of the UK where like my concrete actions, even in terms of Lebanon, other than sending money when I can to people in those various initiatives or friends of mine or whatnot, there's very little I can do other than rant online basically, which isn't really doing much. But it doesn't mean that I then give up and pretend that or act as though the Israelis have already won and there's nothing that can ever stop them or whatnot. I still think it's, my duty as someone from Lebanon, but in general as an anti-authoritarian, to try and understand where does Israel take its strength from? What are the things that it depends on? What are the things that can weaken it? What are sort of like the levers that we can use to put pressure? That sort of thing. And it will always, at least in my experience, always be unsatisfying. But it still needs to be done in one way or another.
Sending words of solidarity, complicating messages, and at least in the US, like there is a lot of military infrastructure that if it's not getting used to bomb Iran, is getting used to support the Israelis bombing the Palestinians and whatever. Mm-hmm. So like one can take inspiration from other movements that have already been trying to focus on decruitment or on stymieing the flow of weapons. And that's like an interesting thing for me, and it might not be, I mean, as we've been speaking for a while and we're kind of closing this up, a pertinent part of this conversation, but the material circumstances of the weapons, you did mention like the U.S. having to bring certain batteries of missile launchers from South Korea over to the Mideast in order to like bolster, because there had already been some of those that were damaged or destroyed by strikes from Iran. And there's been a lot of discussion around the logistics of weapons manufacturing. If cruise missiles that are used by the US cost $1 million, and yet these $20,000 ones that the Iranian regime is even they're running out of, they may have like 1,000 left or whatever, but the US's ability to manufacture those, the amount of time it takes longer. So like if you're in Scranton, there's a facility nearby that produces a lot of these ballistics, a lot of these munitions. Talk to your neighbors. Like, I don't know, all this stuff is all of these weapons, all of these carriers, all of these people that are going over to fire the drones or whatever live in places, they have neighbors, they have families, they have communities, and those are all like even changing, complicating the dialogue. Who knows, a conversation that you have might talk someone into looking into how they can separate from the military,
Yeah, I think we can learn a lot from the responses to ICE, for example, in the US, and how the work, and I had folks on in Minnesota. I mean, obviously you would be very knowledgeable on that too. it didn't, the organization to get to know your neighbor, the long-term thinking to respond to various things did not just happen overnight. It was a very slow process, but we saw the results of it, at the very least, in terms of people able to withstand the state in a way that, maybe in another context, they wouldn't have been able to. Which isn't to mean that victory is guaranteed or that they will be able to last forever, but even if they don't, it doesn't mean that it's not worth doing it for as long as we can.
It's still better than not participating, because it's not going to be exactly what you want to see immediately. Yeah.
Exactly.
Elia, thank you so much for this conversation. Is there anything that you want to mention briefly that I forgot to ask about, or do you feel good about where we're landing with this?
No, I think that's all right. If I don't like doing this, but if folks also have, again, if they do have disposable income and they want to support my own work, like privately, I do have a Ko-fi page as well that we can put in the thing. But I completely and 100% understand if there's like 10,000 other things that are more urgent and whatnot, and there's no hard feelings, but I figured I'll mention it anyway.
Cool. And I believe there's a Patreon for the From the Peripheries that goes to support the sort of media that is having, these impacts and uplifting the voices of people in a lot of cases that are on the ground or from the regions that are being impacted that are on the peripheries, and that aren't heard in our media.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's super important.
Exactly.
Thank you so much again. And I hope to talk to you soon.
Yeah, same, absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
This is The Final Straw Radio. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at TFSR, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. Programming support is brought to you by Firestorm Books, located at 1022 Haywood Road in West Asheville. Firestorm is a bookstore and social movement space owned by its workers, in operation since 2008. Their event calendar and complete catalog of books can be found online at firestorm.coop.